Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I don't think they're talking about the underclass as we usually talk about it. That is people who are unemployed and who are living below the poverty line and so on. But we're talking about a phenomenon that is for middle-class America, a tremendous rise in depression.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Dr. Thomas Dunn, professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. Father Bacik and Dr. Dunn will discuss depression and rising expectations. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Tom, I'd like to talk a little bit about an article that appeared in a recent Psychology Today. It's by Martin Seligman, and it talks about the whole question of depression. In fact, you pointed the article out to me, so I think it'd be good if we talked a bit about it. Now, this Martin Seligman, as I understand it, is a rather renowned expert on the question of depression, is he not?
Yes. He's written quite a bit on it. He's been practicing in the field for 20-plus years, so this is not new. But I thought it was quite an interesting article in terms of its potential power for explaining why, it seems, we have more people depressed now.
Yeah, I mean, he has remarkable statistics in there showing the increase in depression in the last couple of decades. I think he has a statement, something about that young people today are 10 times as prone to depression as their grandparents were.
That's right.
I mean, that is a striking phenomenon. Here we got a culture in which so many good things are happening, and we are so much more affluent than we have been in the past. We have so many more options. Life is better for many people, and yet we have all these depressed people. And I think we're talking about the middle class here and rather well-to-do people. I take it that the sampling, it was done in the cities, I noticed, but I mean, I don't think they're talking about the underclass as we usually talk about it. That is people who are unemployed and who are living below the poverty line and so on. But we're talking about a phenomenon that is for middle-class America, a tremendous rise in depression.
That's right.
Do you want to say anything about the study, Tom, that they did? I noticed they interviewed 10,000 adults in 3 cities. And they started looking at the data is when this all became clear to them. And they point out that, I mean, there could be a lot of different reasons why people end up, why this great rise in depression shows up. It could be that people talk more easily about depression than older people do. But by and large, after they sort through all of the variables, they end up saying there's a tremendously greater rate of depression than we've had in the past.
Right. Well, I don't want to go too much detail, but essentially he talks about interviewing people in St. Louis, Baltimore, New Haven, interviewing people at different age levels, and essentially having them self-report, meaning have you ever been depressed type of question.
Is that considered to be a reliable statistical base?
Well, you can actually do reliability studies to verify that questionnaires can be reliable and what we also call valid.
A quick look on your part, does this study look good to you?
Looks pretty good, especially since you have such similar results across all 3 cities. And essentially, they interviewed people in 4 different age brackets, 65 plus in age, years, 45 to 64 years of age, 25 to 44, and then 18 to 24. And they found very similar results. That is, in the 24 to 44 baby boomer interval, high incidences, 7.5 to 10% of people reported having depressive episodes, compared to 1.8 for 65 plus and 4.2 for 45 to 64.
So the fact of the matter is we got a lot more people running around who are depressed, and especially young people these days.
That's right. Yeah.
And I noticed one thing that he's pointed out was that when you look at manic depression, and as I understand it as a layman, the manic depression suggests that people are in big mood swings and there's something chemically based about it or genetically based. That it remains pretty steady, whether you look at old people or young people.
That's right, in different cultures.
Right,
too.
in different cultures. So that's pretty steady. In other words,
That's
we've got some sort of a genetic problem or chemical imbalance or whatever the cause. physiological causes. But when you start looking at depression that's, as you call it, episodic, that which occurs now and then when people are down, then we got this great increase. I might say just a little bit about some of the symptoms, Tom, that go with this. They talk in here about a sense of hopelessness, giving up, passivity, low self-esteem, and of course then suicide being a
culminating
right
event. That's right. Well, we've all had those episodes. We've all felt down and phlegmatic, and nowadays we have people who have frequent episodes of that, and there are some people who fall in this category who are trait. For want of a better term, we'll say trait, meaning for a good part of their life they seem down. And for that type of person, if an event occurs which is considered unfavorable, it can really hit them much harder than somebody who is generally up.
I think I saw a study recently that was suggesting that fatigue is tightly connected with depression. People who are chronically fatigued often are suffering from depression.
It's one of the classic symptoms of depression, that people feel tired all the time. They don't want to do anything.
And it's worse than you don't want to get out of bed at all, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, that is the irony, because that's exactly what they should do.
Is get into action, yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's right.
Well, Tom, let's start talking about the whys. You suggested at the beginning that the why of this, why this occurs, is really important. And as I understand Seligman's article, he really has two types of causes that he's involved in. One has to do with one's personal life, expectations that we have, and the amount of affluence we have, and so on. And then the other factors are more institutional, as I see it, how one relates to family and to church and to God. So I'd like to bracket the institutional side for a while and focus in on this question of rising expectations and the way that seems to affect the whole business of depression. In fact, Seligman, as I take it, says that it's rising expectations that really is at the core of this increased depression.
Well, it is interesting to look at data like this, and which verifies what a lot of people in the helping professions, psychologists, therapists, counselors have known for a while, that we just have so many more people who are depressed now. So the data are not surprising, but it makes you wonder, how did this all come about? Is it food that we're eating?
Yeah. Well, what they want to do, of course, is to get at this rising expectations notion. And I mean, I take it that let's talk a little bit about how that plays out in practice. I mean, we have that with teenagers who are expecting the good life, or expecting everything to go their way, and are upset when it doesn't happen.
Well, I was struck by the idea, as we were talking about before, and which Seligman brings out in this article about rising expectations. And it was particularly interesting to me because I've been thinking in these terms for years, that what often makes people unhappy is not the event itself, but their expectations have not been met. And when you think about it, that's usually the case. If you're unhappy, it's because things happen the way you don't want them to happen.
Let's get some concrete examples of that.
Well,
someone goes to a party and expects to meet their future spouse at the party, and it doesn't happen. They don't meet the right person.
They may be disappointed.
Yeah.
And but if enough events like that occur, meaning if their expectations somehow are not realistic in terms of what the world is going to present to them, then it'll be a significant number of times at least that they will have expectations that are not met. And Seligman describes these people that over time that they become clinically depressed, and he calls it learned helplessness.
That's an interesting phrase, learned helplessness.
That's right.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, they get to the point of attributing failure to stable factors, meaning they're going to be there forever, global, meaning they're going to affect everything, and perhaps most damaging, something internal. So if you put those things together, something that's stable, oh my God, it's going to be like this forever, global, it affects almost everything in my life, and internal, meaning something about me.
Okay, maybe I'd say, well, I'm a shy person, and therefore, I mean, there's really nothing I can do about that. I'm always going to be shy, and that affects all my relationships, and therefore I can't really relate to people the way I want to.
That's right.
And so before long, I start feeling helpless. There's nothing I can do about this. I'm always going to be shy, and before long, I'm depressed.
That's right, and you won't do anything.
Yeah.
It's cyclical. And of course, then if you don't do anything, then self-fulfilling prophecy comes about. Your life does become less interesting, and then of course it can feed on itself.
We could ask ourselves why this whole business of rising expectations has occurred. I think Seligman links it to the whole sociological analysis, as I see it, of the rise of individualism in our culture,
Right.
and the notion that we are putting more and more stress on the individual and on the self, and there's sort of a climate created that we can do all of these things, or we have this unlimited potential, and all we have to do is grab hold and live with gusto and take
That's
it
right.
all on, and that's what starts to fuel the expectations. In other words, there's an even deeper analysis that we live in an individualistic culture where we've begun to celebrate the self. I was doing a class the other day, and we were talking about the modern world and how theology has changed and so on, and we were talking about in the medieval world, people did not have identity crises. They didn't need to, he didn't have an Erickson running around telling you had identity crisis, because no one had one, because everyone knew who they were, where they fit. They fit into a certain part of the social strata. They had particular duties to do. The marriages were arranged, and no one expected them to be terribly happy. They just were part of the arrangement of life. And so there weren't these rising expectations, and there really was no identity crisis connected with it. Now, here we've got a modern world where we now have options. I think maybe marriage is a good example here. We could use this in a concrete way. So before, marriages were arranged, and you came together, not on the basis of romantic love or anything, out of usefulness, or it welded the families together, or split up the wealth properly, and
Right.
so on. And no one expected to be terribly happy in marriage. Now we've got this whole romantic thing going that says you're supposed to find happiness in marriage. And then we put all kind of pressure on the marriage to say that you two are supposed to make it work and find all your fulfillment in one another. And people get into that kind of situation, and it just can't produce. I mean, they get on each other's nerves rather than
That's true.
Simply find happiness with one another.
And it's such a subtle expectation, people aren't aware of it. And that's probably one of the problems. Some of those expectations are so subtle, we don't realize that it literally sets us up. If our love life isn't as great as movies portray it, as it should be, if we're not always excited with one another, if we don't always have the best vacations possible, if we don't have beautiful-looking children that always get good grades, then it leads us to the garden path of having our violated expectations.
We have the same thing in the church. I was thinking about liturgy. I mean, some of us are really concerned about good liturgies and so on. We start to think that every liturgy's got to be a high, and
Right.
everybody's really got to get excited about it and really feel the presence of the Spirit in a dynamic way. And a lot of times that just doesn't happen. I'm not sure it can happen with tremendous frequency, and yet we get people disappointed because it doesn't happen.
Well, we also see examples that reflect a changing role. In our culture, for example, 20 and 30 years ago, even longer, that teenage girls, their expectations for what their life would be like in the future were very narrowly laid out. They would most likely get married and have children, and if they did work, it might be as a nurse or a teacher, somewhat limited. That's all. If that's all they expected, and then that's what they ended up doing, then they weren't unhappy. And in fact, that's what did happen. Well, we have a large change that's occurred, and so we have now the teenage girl now doesn't have the restricted outcomes of the future the way 30 years ago they did have. But we don't have a very clear structure for them to follow. There's a lot of dissonance, a lot of ambiguity, and in fact, even though they have more free choices, they find stumbling blocks. Things aren't easy. Rising expectations about being able to do all these things are very often met with stumbling blocks. I can't do this, I can't do that, and we have someone who gets depressed, or at least more unhappy.
I was thinking of the racial situation that way. There was a common analysis made in years past about the civil rights movements of the 1960s set up rising expectations, and then when they couldn't be met, often led to violence and to
Absolutely.
great amount of disappointment. So, I mean, it's really a subtle. You used the word subtle before, and I want to go back to that because I think it's important, because it seems to me there is a subtle dynamic going on there. I mean, you certainly can't end up saying, well, the answer is don't have new opportunities for women, for young women, or, you know, we've got to think in terms of equality in our society and mutuality and equal opportunity. And so we can't use your analysis there to say, well, we got to restrict their possibilities, you know. What we got to do is find out how to work within the wider range of possibilities, right?
Well, that's true, but it means we're going to have to find a way to live with ambiguity in the meantime, which we are doing, and probably more successful than perhaps we thought was possible. But we have other examples of that, too. In my classes, I use this example of expectations to describe the frustrated student, if not the depressed student. And I ask people to compare very often. I say, okay, we have this frustration index, and we'll give it a number 75, all right? When you reach 76, that's when the student says, this is unfair, this is unjust, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And I ask people to compare. I say, well, how about how many math problems would it take if a teacher assigned a number of math problems for a student back in 1953 before that student hit that frustration index, compared to how many math problems would it take today? And most everybody agrees, well, back then they might take 30 or 40 before they really got angry, and today it's maybe 8. Rising expectations or violated expectations.
Can we say that this becomes almost an habitual way of thinking then, that it isn't just a matter of, well, there's rising expectations about a particular thing, but that individuals in the culture generally have higher expectations about almost everything?
About their individual power, too.
Yeah.
And that's... I want to say a double-edged sword. We do want people to feel more responsible for their behavior, to be independent. But on the other hand, if we lead them to believe that they have all this power, and then the world, with its natural stumbling blocks and pebbles on the road of life, is going to create some difficulties, and they get very frustrated. Whereas people were more protected, perhaps, in the past because their environment didn't lead them to believe that they had all these choices.
I notice Seligman distinguishes out the California self from the New England self. I find that interesting. The New England self, I take it, is more restrained, has lower expectations, a greater sense of duty. You keep your nose to the grindstone.
You don't worry about how you feel.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's a key. That's a key, right? You don't worry about how you feel. It's like you ask some older people or middle-aged people in marriage counseling, well, how do you feel about it? Well, what do you mean, how do I feel? I mean, I'm here, aren't I? We're living, aren't we? I go to work every day. What do you mean, how do I feel about it? I mean, and just not worried about how they feel. They're not introspective.
That's right.
And so he contrasts that New England style with what he calls the California self. I wonder if he lives out on the West Coast or whatever.
I'm not sure.
But the California style, which is much more introspective, knows feelings, can sort out different emotions and so on, very interested in one's personal development and growth, expects a lot out of relationships. Right? A profile here of the California self.
That's right. And, of course, that's not bad because it's self-knowledge. How can we ever say that self-knowledge is bad?
The Greeks told us that. Know thyself.
That's right. But really, in terms of an evolutionary perspective, we probably haven't evolved to the point of being able to handle that depth of self-knowledge. Because, again, if we keep on reflecting on how we feel, and there are sometimes we feel bad, then why do we feel bad? Oh, my God, I'm not really living up to, what's wrong with me? And that cycle goes on and on. Whereas if you didn't worry about that, you might feel bad one day, but if you worry too much about how you feel, and you're feeling bad, you're going to feel bad about feeling bad.
It's going to multiply, right?
That's
snowball.
Right.
I remember a psychology course I had in class. I'm just flashing on it now. The professor was cautioning us against too much introspection. And he said too much introspection without some third party or other party, I don't know, a God figure or another person, would be dangerous. And he was cautioning us that introspection you can get carried away with that. This is a long time ago in college. I just had forgotten that until this moment. But it's coming back to me now that, St. Augustine in his Confessions, for example, he's very introspective. He looks within. He's remembering everything. But he does it in dialogue with God. In other words, he's sitting there ruminating about what's going on with himself and how he lived and what his motivations were, but it's talking to God about it. And I wonder if there isn't something psychologically healthy about that, of incorporating prayer into the introspection or making that sort of meditative, reflective outlook part of what we're doing.
Yeah, it displaces some of the power outside of ourselves and prevents that over-reliance on self, which I guess one could say also that's what a good therapist can do for you also. Or a structure, some comfortable structure that you can live in. It's a family structure.
Let's start to spell this out more clearly. So we've set the problem is we've got increased depression, especially among young people, and it's probably going to continue to rise in some ways. Although Seligman doesn't say that. I shouldn't put those words in his mouth. But we got
he says maybe
it may go down sometime. That's right. But anyway, we got more depression, and we think we know one reason is because we got rising expectations. We got the California self taking over. Now, what are we going to do about it? I threw out the one idea of prayer. It seems to me prayer could be a good perspective point. Get us in touch with one more powerful than ourselves. That could be part of it. And what else are we going to do to deal with this? We're probably going to cut down on the expectations in some way.
That's easier said than done, of course, and I think that there's no clear solution to this because we live in that world which has, if we are to believe the article, and it sounds convincing, which has created the atmosphere for us to develop this. And it almost requires our lifting ourselves out of ourselves to reflect on that, which is actually doing the same thing again. The therapy, interesting, the therapy, or what we call the cognitive therapy used in depression, actually capitalizes on the self and the reflection on the self. And there's a certain irony there, and that it is a very effective therapy. Cognitive therapy for depression is very effective.
Well, tell me how we do that, cognitive therapy for depression.
Well, we deal with cognitive restructuring primarily, and that is we try to teach the person through self-observation, role-playing, whatever, that it's these thoughts that you're having about your helplessness and how bad things are and how bad you are, which is really causing the depression, not the world.
Yeah. So what we do, the example I used early on, that the young woman who went to the party and thought she was going to meet her future spouse there is going to try to be more restrained in her thinking and say, when I go to the party or when I meet a new gentleman in my life, I shouldn't expect that he's going to be the one. I should just take it for what it's worth, go and have a good time, enjoy it. If something seems to be there, then maybe we'll get together again. But I'm not going to have any great expectations about this. I'll just see where it goes.
Yes,
now,
and
is that the kind of messages she should be giving herself?
Very often, yes. And in fact, even to the point where you would actually ask, if in my perspective, for example, if I'm working as a therapist, I would say, okay, here are the things that you literally should say to yourself on your way to this party. So that when you show up, you're showing up with different types of cognitions in your head, meaning you're not setting yourself up for disaster. Right. Very similar to the things you said yourself. But the irony is you're still dealing with the self and the self's power, and we're reinforcing that.
You're worried that we're going to just generate the problem, right?
Yes, because then we turn around and say, and a good therapist is in fact supposed to say, listen, I didn't help you, you helped yourself.
Yeah.
So there is an irony there. It is effective therapy from what we know, but it still tends to emphasize the power of the self.
It reinforces this individualism that's in our culture.
That's right.
You are going to pick yourself up through your own psychic processes, and by giving yourself the right tapes in your head, you're going to overcome this problem. But again, it is helpful, isn't it? If you go back to the example I used about marriage, here we got people in the modern world marrying for love, picking a partner instead of having an arranged, which is a very different arrangement than we've had through most of history.
That's
you actually pick a marriage partner. I mean, that's strange business historically. And then we'd have to have people when they come to marriage be saying, well, I can't put all the weight on this marriage. My partner cannot solve all my problems. I can't expect my partner to be here always when I need a shoulder to cry on or somebody to laugh with me when I'm feeling good. I can't. That's too much expectation for the relationship. So part of what we would need to do is get a more realistic assessment of this, right?
That's right, but that's difficult, again.
Because of the cultural expectations.
That's right. And different types of therapy, of course, emphasize different types of expected relationships or factors in the relationship that could lead someone to believe and reduce those expectations. But essentially, we have to learn to live in this culture.
It sounds like realism is what we need. I mean, people would have to have a better sense of their own potential. So, I mean, if you got some kid who can't shoot a basketball and run very fast, and he thinks he's going to be in the NBA someday,
That's right.
I mean, we have to get him back into the real world here and deal with the kind of limitations that he has.
That's right. A good discrepant analysis is essentially what you're talking about. In other words, when our expectations are so much different than reality, we have a large discrepancy there. How we handle that discrepancy is very important. If we handle that discrepancy by saying I'm inadequate, then we'll very often lead to depression.
Ah, yeah, I see. So what you don't want to do is throw it back on yourself and say, I'm inadequate, or I'm a bad person, just because I can't get all my expectations met in this marriage.
That's right. Or, in the other
That's
example...
what causes the depression, right? Just to isolate it.
That's right.
It's when you throw it back on yourself and say, I'm inadequate, I'm a bad person, that's why things aren't working out.
Yes, and it's a stable thing. I'm a bad person forever.
Yeah.
It's global because I'm bad in everything, and it's internal as part of me.
No.
So if that is all true, how else should I behave? It'd be very natural for me to be depressed. So it's very logical when people are depressed, because their perception of the world and themselves is such that it leaves them no alternative. What do? They can't do anything. Learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness. And so what we're suggesting is that we have to get out of that, and we've got a number of suggestions we've got here. One is to live in the real world, to live in a realistic way.
Well, Seligman actually coins the term learned resourcefulness as the opposite, where you can learn that you actually are competent, that you can do certain things, and that becomes part of the therapy, of course.
Learned resourcefulness?
Resourcefulness.
Yeah,
right.
okay. Tom, well, we're running out of time here. We've been talking about depression and the problem of rising expectations, how that feeds into it. We've suggested that we can do better by limiting expectations, living in the real world, and coming up with learned resourcefulness, a cognitive way of trying to overcome that and really to change our perspective and attitude. And I've added the note that I think prayer really could be helpful in adopting that better attitude.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Dr. Thomas Dunn, who is professor of educational psychology at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was depression and rising expectations. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.